The first time I saw Scott was at a college seminar. We were both there for extra credit, but we were studying different things. He was a business major, and I was studying literature. I noticed him right away when he asked the professor a tough question. After class, we ended up at the same coffee shop. It felt like fate was bringing us together. We talked about everything: college, our hobbies, and even childhood memories. "I come from a pretty strict family," he said while sipping his coffee. "My parents are very religious." I shrugged. "My parents are more open-minded. They always told me to question everything."
Scott laughed.
"Sounds like we're from different worlds." Even though we were different, we felt a strong connection. We started seeing each other more, studying together, and exploring the city on weekends. After about 3 years of dating, we decided to move in together. It made sense since our apartments were far from campus, and we were spending so much time together anyway. But when Scott told his parents, they didn't take it well. During a dinner at their house, his mom, Mrs. Tyler, was the first to speak up. "Living together before marriage, Scott?"
You know how we feel about that.
Scott shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, times have changed. It's not a big deal." His dad added, "In this house it is. You're living in sin." I could feel their stares, so I tried to ease the tension. "We respect your beliefs, but this is our decision. We're adults." Mrs. Tyler sighed. "It's just not how we raised you." Scott took my hand. "Amy and I love each other, and we want to start our life together. I hope you can support that." The night ended on a heavy note, but Scott and I stuck with our choice. We found a cozy apartment near campus and moved in. Days turned into weeks, then months. Our relationship grew stronger, but the tension with his parents was always there, like a sad background noise. One evening, as we were settling into our new life, there was a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Tyler, holding a pie. "I thought I'd stop by and see how you two are doing," Mrs. Tyler said, looking around with a critical eye. "We're doing great, Mrs. Tyler," I replied, trying to be polite. She sat down and placed the pie on the table. "This is all temporary, right? You'll get married soon?" Scott cleared his throat. "We haven't decided that yet, Mom." As weeks and months passed, the pressure from Scott's parents started to affect us. Our carefree dates and movie nights started to feel different, with a constant expectation of marriage hanging over us. One evening, while we were cooking dinner in our small kitchen, Scott brought it up. "Amy, have you ever thought about having a wedding?" I looked up, surprised. "For us? Are you proposing?" He smiled awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not exactly. I mean, yes, I want to marry you someday, but right now it's more about my parents. Maybe if we had a ceremony, they'd ease up." I sighed. "So, you're talking about a wedding without making it legal?" He nodded. "Just an idea. We could invite our friends, make it fun. My parents get their wedding, and we get some peace." It wasn't the romantic proposal I had imagined, but I understood where he was coming from. "All right," I said slowly, "but only if we do it our way, small and intimate. No big church wedding." Scott grinned, relieved. "Deal." The next few weeks were a blur of planning. We picked a beautiful outdoor spot, invited close friends and family, and organized a simple but heartfelt ceremony. When we told his parents, their reaction was calmer than expected. "An outdoor wedding?" Mrs. Tyler asked, raising an eyebrow. "Well, it's not traditional, but if it means you're taking the next step, I guess we can support it." Mr. Tyler added, "As long as you're committed to each other, that's what matters." The day of the wedding was sunny and bright. I wore a simple white dress, and Scott looked great in a suit. Our friends cheered, and even Scott's parents seemed genuinely happy. During the reception, Mrs. Tyler pulled me aside. "Amy, I want to apologize," she said softly. "I know we've been hard on you both, but seeing you together today made me realize that love is what really matters." I smiled, touched by her words. "Thank you, Mrs. Tyler. That means a lot." The day ended on a high note, with everyone dancing and celebrating our love. It felt like we had finally won Scott's parents over, and I hoped this would be a fresh start. But as time passed, things changed. His parents started visiting us every day, often without letting us know beforehand. They'd show up with advice or subtle criticisms, as if the wedding had given them permission to interfere in our lives. One evening, after a long day, there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, Mrs. Tyler stood there holding a casserole. "Just thought I'd bring you some dinner," she said with a smile that didn't seem entirely sincere. "Thanks," I replied, taking the dish, "but you really don't have to." She waved it off. "It's no trouble. I just thought, since you're both so busy, you might not have time to cook." I forced a smile, feeling the hidden judgment. "We manage, but thanks anyway." After she left, I sighed deeply. Scott put his arm around me. "It'll be okay," he whispered. But it wasn't just the casserole. Soon came the little comments and questions like, "Why is the house so messy?" Or, "Have you thought about cooking something healthier?" Mrs. Tyler would say these things, pretending to be concerned. One day, I came home from work, tired, and found her in our living room rearranging our bookshelves. "Mrs. Tyler, what are you doing?" I asked, shocked. She looked up like it was perfectly normal. "Just thought I'd tidy up." The shelves looked a bit cluttered. Scott walked in with 2 cups of tea. "Mom's just helping out, Amy," he said, trying to smooth things over. I took a deep breath, my patience running thin. "This is our home, Scott. We didn't ask for help." Mrs. Tyler pressed her lips together, her eyes starting to water. "I'm just trying to be helpful. We're family now." These visits became more frequent. They dropped by without warning, offering advice we didn't ask for and criticizing decisions we'd made as a couple. It became clear they no longer respected our boundaries. One evening, after an especially stressful visit, Scott and I sat down to talk. "Scott, this has to stop," I said, my voice shaking with frustration. "I can't live like this, feeling judged in my own home." He ran his fingers through his hair, looking just as stressed. "I know, Amy, but they're my parents. I don't know how to tell them to back off without hurting their feelings," Scott said. I replied, "But what about our feelings? Our peace of mind? We can't keep sacrificing that for them." A week later, we invited his parents over for dinner, deciding to face the issue directly. The evening started off nicely. We talked about work, friends, and the latest news. But as the main course was served, I took a deep breath and said, "Mrs. Tyler, Mr. Tyler, we invited you over because there's something we need to talk about." Mr. Tyler looked up, his fork paused. "What's the matter?" I glanced at Scott, who gave me an encouraging nod. "It's about the frequent visits and, well, the constant advice on our lives." Mrs. Tyler looked surprised. "We're just trying to help." Scott stepped in. "Mom, Dad, we know you care, but it's becoming too much. We need space to live our lives, make our own mistakes, and grow together." Tears filled Mrs. Tyler's eyes. "After all we've done for you, this is how you repay us?" Mr. Tyler added sternly, "We're only looking out for you. It seems Amy doesn't value family." I felt guilty, but stood firm. It's not about appreciation. It's about respecting our boundaries and our choices. The room grew quiet, the tension thick. Mrs. Tyler wiped her eyes with a napkin, her shoulders shaking. "We just wanted to be part of your lives. I never thought it would come to this." Scott looked torn but stayed strong. "Mom, we love you, but this is our life. We need you to understand that." The evening ended with Mrs. Tyler in tears, Mr. Tyler looking disappointed, and an unspoken agreement that things needed to change. As they left, I felt a mix of relief and dread, unsure of what the future would hold for our relationships. In the days that followed, the house was unusually quiet. The constant visits stopped, but the silence felt both comforting and unsettling. Every time the doorbell rang or there was a knock, my heart raced, thinking it might be Scott's parents, but it never was. One evening, as Scott and I sat on the couch, he brought up the topic. "Amy, do you think we were too harsh? They're my parents. Maybe we overreacted." I took his hand, feeling its warmth. "Scott, it's not about being harsh. It's about setting boundaries. We did what we had to do." He sighed deeply. "I know. It's just hard." I never thought we'd end up in this situation with Scott's parents. As the weeks went by, we started feeling the weight of our decision. There were no more surprise visits, but also no calls or messages. It felt like we had completely cut ties. During this time, I found comfort in browsing houses online. One day, as I was scrolling, I came across a beautiful home in a nearby town. It had a big garden, a spacious living area, and most importantly, it was far from all the stress we were dealing with. "Scott, come look at this," I called out. He came over and looked at the screen. "Wow, it's beautiful. But why are you looking at houses?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "I've been thinking maybe it's time for a fresh start. Somewhere new, where we can make our own memories, away from all this drama." He looked surprised. "You mean move? Leave everything behind?" I nodded. "It's a big step, I know. But maybe it's what we need." We talked about it a lot, weighing the pros and cons. The idea of starting fresh was exciting but also a bit scary. Still, the more we discussed it, the more it felt like the right thing to do. A few weeks later, we went to see the house in person. It was even more beautiful, and the neighborhood seemed perfect. After thinking it over, I decided to use the money I had inherited from my grandmother to buy it. When we signed the papers, I felt a mix of excitement for the new beginning and sadness for what we were leaving behind. The move went smoothly, and soon we were settling into our new home. It felt like a dream. The peace and quiet were just what we needed. One evening, as we enjoyed a quiet dinner in our new dining room, Scott said, "Amy, I think this was the best decision we ever made." I smiled, feeling content. "I think so too." The first few months in our new home were perfect. The mornings were peaceful, with birds chirping, and the evenings were calm and relaxing. Scott and I fell into a comfortable routine, enjoying the privacy and quiet our new place offered. It felt like the past was behind us, and the drama that once filled our lives had faded away. Then, one day, everything changed. I was in the kitchen making dinner when the doorbell rang.
Scott went to answer it.
I heard murmurs and then a voice I knew all too well. My heart sank. It was Mrs. Tyler. I walked to the door, shocked. There they were, Mrs. and Mr. Tyler, standing with suitcases at our doorstep. "Mom, Dad, what are you doing here?" Scott asked, his voice full of surprise. Mrs. Tyler smiled, but it seemed a little too sweet. "We missed you, dear. So we thought, why not pay a visit?" I tried to stay calm. "This is unexpected," Mr. Tyler added. "We just wanted to see where our son is living now." "Is that so wrong?" Scott looked conflicted. "Of course not, but a heads up would have been nice." Mrs. Tyler glanced around, her eyes taking in our home. "Oh, what a lovely place you have here. Much nicer than the old one." I felt a bit irritated, but didn't say anything. Their visit turned into a stay. One night became 3, then 4. They started making themselves comfortable, just like they had in our previous home. One evening after dinner, I pulled Scott aside. "Scott, we can't go down this road again. We moved to get away from this."
He sighed.
"I know, Amy, but they're my parents. I can't just kick them out." "Then what? Let them take over our lives again." Mrs. Tyler, who must have overheard us, walked over with tears in her eyes. "Is that how you feel, Scott? That we're a burden?" Scott looked helplessly at me, then back at her. "Mom, it's not like that. We just wish you'd told us you were coming." She sniffled. "We just wanted to be close to our son, but it seems we're not welcome here either." I had a sinking feeling when Scott's parents mentioned they had made a decision about their living situation. Scott and I had been talking privately about how to handle this, and now it looked like the issue was going to come out in the open. "Amy, Scott," Mr. Tyler began, "we have some news." Scott shifted in his seat, already sensing what was coming.
"Go on," he said.
Mrs. Tyler, trying to sound cheerful, said, "We've sold our house. We realize there's no need for it when we have such a lovely family home here with you too." My eyes widened in shock. "You did what?" "We wanted to be closer to you both," Mr. Tyler explained, looking sincere. Mrs. Tyler looked hurt. "We're family. Why wouldn't you want us here?" I took a deep breath and finally said what I had been holding back. "This house, it's mine. It's not owned by both of us. It's in my name only." I went to the study and brought back the ownership documents. Mrs. Tyler looked at the papers, then back at me, clearly stunned. "But you're married. What's yours is Scott's and vice versa." I smiled slightly. That's where you're mistaken. We had a wedding ceremony, yes, but Scott and I never legally married. We never signed any official documents. So technically, you're not my in-laws. The weight of my words hung in the air. Mrs. Tyler's face turned pale, her eyes wide in disbelief. Mr. Tyler looked from me to Scott, speechless. Mrs. Tyler looked to Scott, hoping for him to deny what I said. But Scott took my hand, showing his support. "It's true, Mom and Dad," he said calmly. "We thought you'd accept things more if we had a ceremony, but we never felt the need to make it legal." Mrs. Tyler began to cry. "So you deceived us, and now you're throwing us out?" The tension in the room was thick. The shock quickly turned into anger. "So, you fooled everyone with a fake wedding, and you think that makes everything okay?" Mrs. Tyler's voice was sharp. Scott sighed. "It wasn't about fooling anyone. It's how we wanted to live. The ceremony was for us, and for those who wanted to celebrate our love." Mrs. Tyler's face turned red with frustration. "You defy marriage, live in sin, and mock us with a fake wedding? I've had enough." Mr. Tyler stood up abruptly. "You, young lady, are a sinner, a witch, pulling my son away from his family and his values." I was shocked by their strong reaction, but I stood my ground. "I haven't taken Scott from anyone. He's made his own choices, and you need to respect that." Mrs. Tyler, her eyes filled with tears, but her voice firm, said, "Scott, come home with us. Leave this woman. She's done nothing but trap you in her lies." Scott, always calm, replied, "Mom, Dad, I love you both, but my place is here with her. She's been nothing but kind, even when you haven't. You can't just ask me to leave her." "You're choosing her over us?" Mr. Tyler's voice was filled with anger and disbelief. "I'm choosing to live my life the way I want," Scott answered. The room fell silent. The air was thick with tension. Mrs. Tyler's face showed hurt and betrayal. "Fine," she said coldly. "But remember, you're turning your back on your family, on your faith, all for her." "I'm not turning my back on anyone," Scott said softly. "I just wish you'd understand." Mrs. Tyler's voice was bitter as she turned to her husband. "Let's go." She didn't look back as they left, leaving behind a wave of hurt, confusion, and uncertainty. I looked at Scott, and his face reflected the same feelings I had. We both knew things had changed forever, and there was no going back. I was heading home from work when my neighbor, Mrs. Peter, called out to me. She was an older lady known for her daily walks and knowing all the local gossip. "Did you hear about the Tyler family not selling their house?" she asked with a knowing look. I stopped, surprised. "What do you mean?" She leaned in, lowering her voice. "They never put their house on the market. Angela heard it from Sharon, who works at the town's real estate office. There's no record of their property being for sale." A knot formed in my stomach. Had they been lying to us this whole time? When I got home, I told Scott what Mrs. Peter said. He looked shocked. "I can't believe they'd lie to us. What were they trying to do?" We both knew the answer. They were trying to manipulate us. It was hard to accept. While we had been trying to understand and accommodate them, they had been playing games. Scott sighed, rubbing his temples. "This changes everything. It's one thing to have disagreements, but outright lying is something else. We can't let them keep pulling us into their manipulative games." I nodded firmly. "We need boundaries, real ones." "You're right," Scott agreed. "We can't keep living like this. It's unhealthy for us and our relationship." The next day, Scott went to his parents' house to confront them and get some answers. When he came back, he looked a mix of angry and sad. "They admitted it," he said, his voice heavy. "They thought if they moved in with us, we'd be a proper family again. They felt threatened by how independent we've become." We sat down to talk about what to do next. It was clear that, for our own peace of mind and the health of our relationship, we needed space from them. "We need a break," Scott said. "Some time away from all this drama and manipulation." "I agree," I said. "It's the best decision for us right now." That evening, we sent a message to his parents, letting them know about our decision. Their reply was full of anger and accusations, but we stood firm. We needed this time for ourselves and our future. The next few weeks were peaceful. We focused on each other, rebuilding the trust and closeness that had been strained over the past months. One evening, as we sat on our porch looking at the stars, Scott turned to me. "Thank you," he whispered, "for standing by me, for fighting for us." I smiled and squeezed his hand. Always. The journey had been long and full of challenges, but it reminded us of how important boundaries, honesty, and mutual respect are in any relationship. As the night deepened, we looked ahead, hoping for peace and understanding in the future.